today's webinar. This is a monthly webinar. Topic is Pragmatics of Agility. In today's session, we will reflect upon, we've had many sessions on Agile, various parts of Agile development in the last several months. And today we will take the time to reflect upon the essence of Agile and discuss some of the common blockers and impediments that come in the way of achieving agility and speed in software development, and conclude the discussion with some practical guidance on how to really adopt Agile and get over these blockers. I'm delighted to have a very passionate practitioner of Agile development, Venkat Subramaniam, with us today. He has trained a number of software developers and mentored a number of teams worldwide, and has even authored a number of books. In fact, one of the books is a 2007 Jolt Productivity Award-winning book called Practices of an Agile Developer. So he's a real good authority to talk to us about the essence of Agile and the common blockers that he sees in his work with his teams and clients. So I'm going to transfer over to you, Venkat. But before I do that, I'm going to just quick, by way of ground rules, we will run through the prepared presentation for about 45 minutes or so. And along the way, you welcome people who are in the audience. You're welcome to ask any questions and keep sending your questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll keep tracking them. I'm Hemant Alhans. I'll keep tracking them and inject those questions along the way wherever they make sense to be injected. And then still we'll leave some time, about 10 minutes or so towards the end, to take any other questions that may not have been picked up along the way. With that, over to you, Venkat.
Thank you very much, Hemant. It's a pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about practices of pragmatics of agility. Let's start with first a couple of questions that we may have in our mind. The first question is, what's agile development? And I'm going to say, are we really being agile? If we have stand-up meetings, is that kind of a litmus test we could use to say, yep, our team is agile? Or is it because we're doing unit tests? Or is it because we don't do any documentation? There are people who are so happy not doing documentation, and they want to be on board for agility. So the question is, what can tell us that we are being agile? What makes us agile? And more important, I would say, why should we really care? But the real question to ask and somewhat distinguish between agility and agile development is very important. What is agility? It is the ability for us as individuals, teams, and organizations to be able to respond to ever-changing business conditions. This is one of the things organizations and also as individuals have to constantly confront. We cannot ignore the realities of the world around us and then nosedive into some implementation process. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that agile process, in the absence of agility, is like wings on a penguin. You can flap around all day, but you cannot fly. So it's important for us to, from time to time, keep the big picture in our mind. Why are we doing this? And a lot of times people get hung up on the implements, and in the process miss out on the real benefits of agile development. So implements are important, but not any more important than keeping track of where the business is heading and if we are really succeeding in the process. But why? The reason, of course, is because change is the only constant. Darwin said it's not the fittest that survive, but it's the most adaptable. So one of the things about agility is adaptability. We need to constantly look for it. So the first thing I want to talk about is, how do we meet requirements? And I'll kind of swing around this topic and come back to this towards the very end again to address this. But to begin with, if we take requirements and we want to be able to define what the requirements are, what the scope of the project is, and oftentimes we are asked the question, how do we budget for this project? How much time is it going to be to complete this project? So we need to know as much as we can. But this reminds me of an experience a long time ago back in school. my professor wanted me to implement a program that would track the trajectory of a spacecraft. So I wrote the code, compiled it, ran it, and what it told me was that the spaceship was over here. I looked up the answer, and it was totally wrong. The spaceship was actually very far away. So my first thought was, oops, I made a mistake in my code. Let me go find what the bug is. And after looking through the code quite extensively, I realized there was nothing wrong in my code. And then I went on to study a little bit more, and I realized the problem was not in the code. The problem was that time delta t that I used to run this code. So I lowered the delta t, reran the application, and now the result was much better and closer to the reality of where the spacecraft was. So I realized two things. The first thing I realized was, thank goodness I don't work for NASA. We'll have people lost in space. The second thing I realized was that when you lower the delta t, the error becomes lower, and as a result, you're much closer to the reality. And years later, I was working on projects, and I realized the similarity between this and running projects, software projects. The delta t that I talked about here is the time between taking a set of requirements and going back to get the feedback from our customers whether what we implemented is what they are expecting us to implement. If this delta t is large, then the margin of error multiplies, and we end up far away from what our customers want. But if the delta t is small, in matter of maybe weeks and even to matter of days and hours, then the margin of error is much smaller because we can take corrective measures along the way and fix it. So this is one of the first things about Agile development. So once again, I would say, what is Agile development? And I want to emphasize, it really is feedback-driven development. To me, the most important thing about Agile development is the feedback cycle. If we don't have the feedback cycle in place, and if we don't receive and respond to the feedback along the way, then everything else we do, I don't think it really matters. So it's extremely important for us to have this feedback cycle along the way as we develop our application. So the feedback is very critical. So we start off with the requirements, and we are trying to implement and arrive at a critical release. And the requirements you start with may not be the ones that you actually end up in releasing the product. So it's important for us to keep in mind, if our objective is to build what our customers wanted, we will fail. What we need to be building is what our customers still want and what's still relevant. So that's one of the reasons to have this feedback cycle along the way. So in the feedback-driven development, there are two types of feedback that we want to keep in mind. One is what I call as this inner circle of feedback. I call it as the feedback where the code is doing what the programmers expected it to do, and the outer circle of feedback, which is where the code is doing what our customers want it to do. And I want to say this outer circle is the circle of relevance, and it's important for us to have this circle of relevance. So the question we would ask is, which of these two circles is important? I have come across organizations where they consider the inner circle to be the most important. And this is when programmers are predominantly driving the Agile development process. Unit testing is very important for them, and they focus heavily on development practices and programmer practices. And sure, that's important, but unfortunately, what happens if they ignore the outer circle? If they ignore the outer circle, then what happens is the program may be doing what it's doing, but it may not be relevant to the customers. So there's no point in running really fast in the wrong direction. So if organizations completely ignore the outer circle and exclusively focus on the inner circle, then they end up delivering something that's not relevant, and all the time and money spent on the project may not really get the results. So we could argue that the outer circle is pretty important. I've also come across organizations where they focus heavily on the outer circle and then end up ignoring the inner circle. They say we need to get the feedback cycle, let's talk to the customers, let's get their input. Well, let's think about what happens if we ignore the inner circle and focus only on the outer circle. Well, as a project manager, you have a team of brilliant programmers who can get coding done really fast. You go to your customers and say, hey, here's something we have built over the past couple of weeks. Let's show it to you, get your feedback. Because we want to get your feedback, we want to make sure what we're doing is relevant. The customers look at it, and have you ever had a customer who looks at what you're showing them and come and thank you and hug you and say, wow, that's great, that's exactly what we wanted? Well, if you have customers like that, we don't need to talk anymore. But the reality is, the customers always come back and say, well, it's not exactly what we wanted. We were really thinking about this and that, and we want this to be changed. You say, no worries. This is all about Agile development. We'll get back to you in a couple of days. You go to your team and say, hey, guys, go ahead and fix these things. And while you're at it, go ahead and make these changes and enhancement as well. And the team goes at it. You go back to the customers and say, what do you think now? The customers say, oh, that's great. Thanks, you fixed it. Oh, by the way, that other window, that didn't work that way last time, was it? And they realize something is broken. And they ask you to fix it. You go back to your team, get that fixed. You go back to the customers. And now you find that something else that worked before is broken now. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, there's a name for this. Those of you who have kids, or those of you who have been kids, know exactly what this is. When you go to Chuck E. Cheese, there is this wooden plank with a lot of these different molds on it, and the kids are given a wooden hammer. And the kids love playing this whack-a-mole because they don't know which mold is going to pop up next. And they take the hammer and hit these molds randomly as they pop up, and it's a lot of fun for these kids to play this whack-a-mole. But then when these kids grow up and become programmers, I don't think organizations and customers are happy to be paying for whack-a-mole software. So the point here is, if you really want to continue with this feedback-driven development, you cannot continue to produce code without knowing that the code that you produce not only works, but continues to work as you evolve the software. So while the outer circle seems to be extremely important, it will collapse if we don't have the inner circle to support it and fortify it. So to answer the question, which of those two is important, it is important that we focus on both of these feedback cycles. You want to have a very rapid feedback cycle, certainly, but at the same time, you want to avoid the whack-a-mole software, so you need the inner circle to support the process. So both of them are extremely important for us to have. But this goes to the next interesting thing to think about. Nobody gets together and says, we love Waterfall and we want to do Waterfall development. At least most people don't. Now, but why are we forced towards a Waterfall approach? Well, let's think about this. If you want to develop a software and gather requirements and do analysis and design and implementation, integration, and then do the testing gets pushed to the very end. And what happens in this case is the testers become the bad guys. Nobody wants to deal with them because the testers at this point are the people standing between you and the release of the product. And so you want to get this out of the way. So a lot of times we don't tend to like testers in this particular role. And they become adversaries on projects. But that's not the way to do it. In an agile development, we want to do testing along the way. Now, this is very intimidating and may sound very odd to people who have never done this. How could you possibly be testing along the way? We need to have things stable enough for us to be able to test it. And that's a fair question to have. For example, if you look at this picture here, we are saying in the first iteration, we will develop a little bit of a requirement, implement it, do the analysis, design, implementation, and testing, and then we will continuously go through this. But imagine this for a minute. Let's say we want to follow this approach. We go ahead and hire some really good testers who are very quick in running tests, and we put them in a corner and say, you guys are going to be testing the software as we develop it. In the first iteration, just for an example, let's say we implemented 4 different user stories. And your testers go, do a testing on it. And let's say that takes them a total of about 2 days to do the testing. And they say, yep, we are done with it. Well, in the next iteration or sprint, you decide to do, let's say, 4 stories. Now the testers will protest saying they don't have to test 4 stories, they need to test 8 stories because they need to test the stories you implemented in the first iteration plus the stories that was implemented in the second iteration as well. Because as we touch the code, anytime we touch the code, something could be broken. So as a result, they need more time to do the testing. When it comes to what the 4th or the 5th iteration, they simply cannot keep up with the pace because there's a lot more for them to test, and there's no way they can do all the testing because every time you touch the code, they would have to go through and run all the regression tests. So they're going to tell you that they need more time to do the testing. And then you say, gee, if that is the case, I can't let my programmers sit there and twiddle their thumbs while the testers take the time to test it. We got a great idea. Let's go ahead and have the programmers code for a little while, and then when they are done, we will have the testers do the testing. Notice how we may get dragged down to the waterfall approach because we simply cannot keep up with the pace. So the point here is that one of the key things to think about is, as a tester, our responsibility as a tester is to author test cases, but never actually to run them. In fact, one of the first things I would say of a good tester is to find a way to automate the test cases so they can write the test cases, but don't have to run it. Now, quickly, testers will tell you probably that everything cannot be automated, and they are right. But just because everything cannot be automated doesn't mean we automate nothing. So the challenge to the team would be how much of the test, how much of the application can you automate the test? Is it 10%, 20%, 80%, or 90%? What is it? And it's one of the things important for us to think about. When people say we cannot do it, I'm reminded of a quote. I don't know who said this, but the quote is, do not confuse your inability with impossibility. So if I say I don't know how to do it, maybe we'll find other people who figure out a way to do it, or I may work with other people who can figure out a way to do it. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to do. It simply means that I don't have a clue how to do it. And oftentimes, we need to think about how do we automate test cases. So error rate in manual testing is comparable to the bug rate in code being tested. Oops, there's a bug already there in my slide there. So that's the Boris Basis quote. And you cannot sustain the pace of manual testing by having a larger team. This is one of the fallacies. Companies think they can hire more testers and have them run through manual testing, but it's impossible to keep up with the pace. Automation is extremely important for us to be able to achieve the kind of agility that we are talking about. Well, where do you automate? So oftentimes, if your application has some business logic and a graphical user interface on top of it, you may try to write the automated test on the top. Unfortunately, this rarely works. There may be exceptions to this, but I've been seeing real good cases where this actually works. It's pretty hard to automate this. It is very hard, not only hard, but it's ineffective, but it's also very brittle. It breaks too easily. Oftentimes, people give up on automation because of this. But what is really important is this. You want to be able to insert your automated tests between the graphical user interface and the business logic. Now, the problem is, in legacy applications, it may be very hard to do this. And the reason is that the graphical user interface, even though we all will agree it's back to put business logic in the graphical user interface, we often find business logic in the GUI. So this automation becomes hard to surpass the GUI and then do the testing below. But automation and testing itself is more of a design issue rather than a testability issue. In other words, for an application to be testable, it has got to be designed the way for it to be tested. So at least for any new application and for applications that are going through refactoring, we could try to achieve this and then for existing applications start moving towards this and increase our coverage of automation as much as we can. The next thing I want to talk about here, we talked about getting continuous feedback. We then talked about getting to automate our test cases. We talked about the feedback cycle. But one of the challenges people meet is, you say, okay, that's all nice, a good idea, but our application requires a very strong and powerful architecture. It is going to take us several weeks, if not months, for us to build our architecture. We need time to develop the messaging layer. We need time to develop the database layer. We need to have time to develop this framework we are planning to build and reuse. We need time for all of this. But unfortunately, though, in Agile development, we cannot afford to take the time to build the architecture for several weeks to months without really getting active feedback about the product's usability from the customers and the value it provides. But let's view this a little differently. If you think about architecture, almost everybody would agree that architecture is extremely important. It is very significant. We'd better get it right. We cannot afford to make mistakes in the architecture. And typically, when do we develop the architecture? I would say we typically develop the architecture way in the beginning of a project. In fact, this is something we had in mind even before we probably start writing any code. And so we decide on the architecture very early. Let's just put that thought away for a minute. Let's revisit this in a second. But if you look at the timeline and the knowledge that people have about a particular application, I would say it looks something like this. In the beginning, we don't have a whole lot of knowledge. We may think that we do, but our understanding rapidly changes as we start developing applications. And then as we move towards the application, I would say about 40 to 50% into the project is when we begin to understand quite significant things. And then as we progress further, we know most of the things we need to know about the project. So if this is true, let's put these two together for a second. If in the beginning we don't know a whole lot about a project, but that is when, from the previous discussion, we decided we're going to create the architecture. Now think about this for a minute. Architecture is so important. It is very important to get it right. We cannot afford to make a mistake in the architecture, and yet we will do it when we have the least knowledge about the application itself. What does that mean? There's only one thing that means. The way we are doing this is very high risk. So it is important for us to reconsider how we approach the architecture of a system. It is important for us to, yes, create an architecture. It is important to get it right. But why not take the time to develop the architecture maybe over the first few iterations? We don't want to, it's not to say that don't think of architecture. It's not to say that you don't want to come up with an architecture in the beginning, but let's not set that in stone, but instead let's come up with an idea, a working solution, and say, here's a candidate architecture. Let's make sure this will stand the test of our system and the realities of the product. And if we find something is not suitable, if we find that something is not the right thing to do, we will have the courage to say, yeah, we thought about that, but that doesn't seem to be the right thing to do. Let's go ahead and change it to what is right. And let's do that in the first few iterations so that by the end of maybe the first 4 or 5 iterations, our architecture would have evolved to be something that's not only significant and important, but also very relevant and supportive to the product that we are trying to develop.
Okay, can I inject a question here on this architecture topic? This is relevant here. Yes. So in some cases, what happens is the teams are doing repeated projects. So they are in the same domain, and so therefore the level of unknown that you pointed out in your graph is not as high as it would be in a brand new project. But this is a 6th project or the software development project that the same team is doing in the same domain, and therefore they have a lot more knowledge about the scope and requirements and all that stuff. So in those cases, sometimes teams tend to err on the side of, now that we know what the work is, let's spend some time in architecting it up front properly. So that's the tendency of those teams. Is there anything wrong with that?
No, that's a very fair point, and I don't think there is anything wrong with it. except there are a couple of things very important for us to keep in mind. The first thing is, you certainly want to leverage on the knowledge that you already have as far as the domain and the product is concerned. Having said that, just because it's the sixth product that we're trying to build on a same platform doesn't mean we have to stick to it. And I'll give you an example of this from a company that almost everyone knows, but I can't mention the name here. I was talking to them, and what they were saying is, hey, you know, this is all nice to hear, but the code we write has to fit into this architecture. And from my observation, the architecture they have is very heavyweight. And to make the simplest of change, they have to bring 20 layers and change 20 layers for making a simple change in the product. And when I pointed it out to them, they said, but you don't understand. We have to fit into this architecture. We have to build on this. And I told them, you can go build on this architecture, and while you're doing it, your competition is going to be eating your lunch. And unfortunately, that just happened. And that is one of the biggest problems. Yes, we want to leverage on what we already have, but at some point we also have to have the wisdom and the courage to say, this doesn't seem to be the right fit. Maybe we should think about reducing the layers here, or maybe even re-architecting it, and not just force ourselves to follow something because that's the way it's being done. If you are convinced that what you have is lightweight and working, then certainly you don't want to reinvent the wheel and waste your time on it. So there's a balance that has to be struck in that, I think. So one of the things to keep in mind is we cannot put a project on autopilot. This brings back memory to a project. There was a development manager who said, we are agile, we have defined the requirements, my team is working on it, I don't have to worry about it. And they know exactly how to fix it, and they know exactly how to deliver the product. I went to the team and I asked them what they think, and they said they had no clue what they're working on because they've been given this massive requirement but have no directions and help and support and feedback since then. So there is a disconnect among people sometimes that because they're on an agile project, they somehow don't have to do good management on the project. And that is a pretty risky thing to do. Your organization and projects cannot be put on an autopilot. It requires a continuous and active governance of the project. That is very critical. I want to say this is not about micromanaging. There's a difference between micromanagement on one side and being indifferent and aloof on the other side. It's an active governance that's very important on the projects. That's very important. And the longer that you forecast your product, the greater is the margin of error that you need to be aware of. So that is something to think about. So let's think about this for a second. I remember a project I was on. My boss calls me up and says, I got a good news for you. We're going to start a project on the March 1st. I said, yeah, that's great. What can you tell me about the project? And he said, well, it's due on December the 1st. I said, okay, that's good to know. What else can you tell me about the project other than it's due on December the 1st? And I was told that I'll be dead if I don't finish it by December the 1st. Unfortunately, that doesn't help us a whole lot. You say, okay, fine, we're under this condition to finish this project. Let's work really hard to finish this project. So you work really hard, and right about July 1st, you realize this just is not going to happen. So you go to the boss and say, hey, this project, is it really due on December the 1st? And the boss stares at you and says, you better go back to your desk and finish this because if we don't get this out in December 1st, we all are dead. So we work really, really hard, and the deadline comes and the deadline goes. We probably put out something around the deadline, and then what happens? Well, there are projects I've seen where we spend months and months fixing bugs. And then eventually, when all of the bugs get fixed, this could be 6 months on some projects. I've also seen projects where this is quite a few years after the supposed delivery date. And then that's when finally the product actually gets delivered. I call this the industry-wide hypocrisy when it comes to project management. We need to be a little bit more sensible in the way we develop projects. I'm not interested in saying, here's the deadline, let's stick to it. Don't get me wrong, deadlines are very important, but developing a product that works, provides value to the customers, and brings revenue to the company is extremely important, more important than just deciding on a particular order-free deadline. So there are three things to think about. There's quality, there is time, and there is scope. Now, I want to emphasize that all the three here are variables. And a lot of times people will say, well, we can never compromise quality. I think there are two mistakes in that statement. The first mistake is when people say we cannot compromise quality, they often do. And they just don't accept, they're in denial that they compromise quality. The second thing is, I don't think quality is something you can never compromise. I'll give you an example of this. I work with different types of groups and different companies and so on. And sometimes, or quite often sometimes, I run into a research group. What this research group is doing is they are trying to invent a new algorithm or a new way of addressing a certain problem or solving a problem. And all that they are doing is they're in a pure innovative mode. They're coming up with a research idea, and all that they are doing right now is to prove to the funding agency that they do have a solution. Now, if I go into the team and say, hey guys, you're writing code, quality is very important, where are your unit tests? I would be pretty stupid in asking those questions. Because the goal of the project is not to deliver a product, but it's a research initiative to come up with a solution to a particular, maybe a drug they are trying to implement, or they are trying to come up with a new algorithm for solving a certain problem, whatever it is. And so in that case, the quality of the code is really not the concern at all. But in the same teams, once they get through and get their publications out, when they prove to their funding agencies that they have finished that particular process, then they go to what I call as industrialization of their products. They take it from a proof of concept point of view, and they develop products that they can release. And at that time, the quality is extremely important. In the same way, a lot of things we do in companies, we got to ask ourselves this question. Hey, what is the quality that's acceptable to this particular product? If it's a product that's extremely short-lived, it's a one-off throwaway project, I would say quality is not that important. On the other hand, if it's a product that you support and you want to get reliability out of it, and you have people whose money and life depend on it, quality is extremely important. In the same way, time and scope are variables too. And there are projects which have to be released by a certain date. And there are projects that cannot be released if you don't have a certain scope. But what's important is, in these three things, there are only two that you can fix, and the other turns into a dependent variable. In other words, you cannot 100% fix the quality, the time, and the scope and expect to get the results out of it. So this is where adaptive planning comes in. And no plan survives the contact with enemy is an interesting quote. And it's more important to succeed in the project than stick with a predetermined plan. So it's important for us to understand how these three affect and vary. And if we want to fix all the three, then the result is simply a failure, and that's what we end up getting. So we have to be very realistic about it. So when it comes to adaptive planning,
so Venkat, can I inject a couple of questions before you move off from this topic?
Sure.
So on your resource or that triangle, what about accounting for the budget/resources, which is you could, given a scope and quality guidelines, you could achieve the same timeline of deliverable by increasing or decreasing, for that matter, the resources that you put on it. How do you account for that?
I think resources are very important to consider as well. And a lot of times I see resource and time being somewhat of a dependent variable also. The more time you spend, the more budget or money you would probably need depending on the resources you have also. So certainly it's important to bring in the resources to the discussion as well. But having said that, If you have let's say for a minute that you are really focusing on a project with a certain very critical timeline, then that increases the severity of the resource. You may say, well, we really need people with exactly these skills and experience and domain knowledge to be able to finish within this timeline. And on the other hand, if the resource you can have is not going to meet that requirement, then you may say, hey, based on the resource we have, it's not realistic to meet this timeline. So resources are certainly important to bring into the discussion, but I don't consider them as in the same level as these three. It's somewhat orthogonal, but certainly has an impact on achieving the results of this also. There are other things we need to consider as well. You know, you could consider resources, but there are several other issues. For example, let's say a competition just announced a particular product and that is a game changer. Then none of the other things really matter because you may have to abandon the ship and move to doing something totally different. Any project plans that you already have, even products you have in development plans may not make any more sense. The company may have to think about, hey, how do we create a brand new product? Should we go acquire another company? It's a strategic decision at that point. So there are several other influences we need to certainly consider. But when I consider only a product development phase, I would say, you know, assuming that you can get a certain resource based on your availability, company availability, resource availability, and so on, then I think these three things play a role. But certainly these three things are not the only things that influence our ability to succeed as a company, though. Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you say you have more questions or further questions on that?
Yeah, the other question on the same triangle is that seems missing in the considerations is what Agile talks about, the value. Because there's an alternative project management triangle that is talked about in the Agile circles, which is instead of resource, time, and scope, what about things like first and foremost value constraints and perhaps time?
Right. So once again, I don't consider those from purely a project management point of view, not because they're not important, but that's because those are orthogonal considerations in my opinion. Not only do you want to consider the value of the product, but you also have to think about other issues. For example, is the product feasible? Is it feasible to implement it with the technologies that we can acquire? Just like we talked about resources, maybe I want to do something, but is it feasible to do it? What if we find out that it's going to cost us $3 million to implement this? Well, it doesn't make sense to do it because it's more expensive to do it than to, we're going to burn all the money doing it compared to the revenue we expect to get from it. So these kind of considerations go even before a project, development activity. I would say these things are, not that you wouldn't consider this along the way, but these things play a very vital role, in a higher level, if you will, than the level of, discussion that we're looking at in terms of these three things, contributing to active project development. But those things are orthogonal and have to be, considered as well.
Okay.
So from the point of view of the project planning itself, the first thing I would avoid doing is setting one date when we will finish the project. If you look at this particular diagram here, we are saying we're going to have this project initially planned to finish on this particular date. That clearly makes sense. If you think about, how let's look at weather forecasting. I remember when we had the Hurricane Ike through Houston a couple of years ago. I was actually in Europe that week, and one of my clients wrote me saying, hey, maybe we should change our plans because we got an hurricane. And I was not watching the TV. I was abroad. I looked at the weather map. It showed this somewhere near Florida and pointing towards New Orleans. I said, oh, gee, this is going to go back to New Orleans. How sad it is. But of course, we know the rest of the history. It changed directions, and it ran through Houston. It was, in fact, what was interesting is There were people from Columbus, in Ohio, who were trying to come down to Texas to help, and the hurricane turned around and caused damage along the way, and they had to turn back and go. The point is, a project is a lot like that. And when you look at the weather map, they never draw a line at you. What they do is they draw what is called a cone of uncertainty. And it's important to think about that kind of cone of uncertainty when it comes to projects. And in the very beginning of the project, the margin of error is wide. As you develop the project along the way, you can start looking at more details based on the realities of the project and how it's being implemented. We can start to come up with a better estimation and better certainty, so the cone will start shrinking along the way. One of the nice things about Agile development is that it gives an opportunity for us to come up with an estimate and then not just put faith in the estimate, but start looking at how we are processing every step of the way. Every one of these vertical bars you see down here is an opportunity for us to get a feedback on the realities. Based on the realities, we can refine our estimates and make adjustments. And the reason why this is important is, it is said that every project has a time when it can be turned towards success or failure. But that point in time seldom lies towards the end of the project. Each one of these opportunities is the point that we can modify and make changes starting way early and about continuously on the project. But that really brings up to something else about how do we manage our sprints or iterations. And this is something I see quite often in companies. They take their development cycle and they slice it into different iterations or sprints, whatever you want to call it. And they say, hey team, you're going to work on iteration 2. We're going to come down to the iteration planning meeting or sprint planning meeting. We're going to give you a bunch of user stories. None of them is really well defined. We'll answer some questions for you, and then we'll kind of figure out the details as we go along. But what we really need now is your estimates. And the teams usually struggle to come up with estimates. They have a lot of unanswered questions. And as they develop through the iteration, they discover a lot of things that were not quite defined, and that just throws the project schedule in a spin, and they're not able to do much in the iteration. And I've seen this happen quite frequently, but fortunately there is a different way to do it, even a better way to do it. And I've seen the better way work in projects as well. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So let's first say, one of the problems is, in Agile development, we say, let's not really define a lot of things upfront. Well, that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean we will ignore the realities and completely not define anything at all and kind of figure out things along the way just in time. So think about this as a pendulum. On one end of the pendulum is where you define everything upfront. On the other end is where you define everything just in time. I think both of those endpoints are very risky. We will fail as much not defining things at all as when we define everything upfront. As human beings, we lack the capability to think about and look at a lot of things in one time. We are better doing things in smaller quantity along the time. But at the same time, if we don't spend enough time and effort on a particular activity, then we cannot expect to have enough details available for it, and it becomes very poor in terms of providing enough things for the team to manage their activities. So what I've seen work really well is, let's say we have a team of people, and let's logically divide the team into two. The first one on the top is where I have the product owner, the customers, the development manager, and a lead programmer and a lead tester. These people are going to be involved in what I call as a product spur. And I also have the other group of people where I call this as a project spur, where we have customers, team testers. This is the core of the team who are doing the development and coding and testing activities, along with the team leader and the programmers in this particular team. And so the common link between these two
Venkat, are you there? I don't know if anybody cannot hear Venkat or if it's just me for some reason who can't hear. So let me know, folks. Yeah, so I can hear some people not.
About it was this 10.
Okay. Hey, Venkat, you had, for some reason, we lost you for a minute or two. So,
oh, sorry. Where did you lose me? Should I start back with this slide?
Yeah, if you can, that'll be great.
Okay, no worries. So let's get back to the problem in the approaches. If you have, I consider this as two extremes. On one extreme, we say, let's gather all the requirements in.
Hey, Venkat, when you came back, there's a lot of static when you came back, and I don't know if anything changed on your front, or it's just the network. Now it's much better.
Yes, it seemed to have appeared, and I think it's the evil forces gathering against us, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the point here is, on one extreme, we gather all the requirements and thoroughly detail everything. On the other extreme, we just discover things as we go along. And both extremes are very dangerous. And I think we'll fail in both equally bad. And as human beings, we are really not good at dealing with a lot of stuff in one time. We're also not good at, just doing things just in time, because we don't have enough time and effort put in to learn about things and explore and discover things. And a lot of things come out and get ironed out when we spend the time discussing those things. So the point here I want to make is, we're going to have two separate iteration cycles. At the very top is where the product owner, the customer, the development manager, and a lead programmer and a lead tester participate in it. One of my goals with this is, I want my programmers to be undisturbed and they can focus on the programming activity, and so can the testers. Now, in the bottom iteration cycle, these are concurrent parallel iteration cycles that go on. I'll get into the details a little bit now. And in the bottom one is where the development activity, programming testing happens. This involves quite a few customers, but also the testers and the programmers certainly are part of this. And the link between these two groups is the team leader and the lead tester and the lead programmer. Now, the point here is, let's say we're looking at the bottom here, iteration 2. This is where we're going to code, let's say, 10 user stories. I don't want the team to be given 10 stories and say, go estimate this. We can't give you all the details right now. So what's going to happen is, in a phased out period, at the top, we have the product spur where the cycle, the iteration 2 here, is detailing the user stories that potentially will be part of this iteration 2. So at this phase, the iteration 2 here, these guys are detailing the user stories, and there are 3 main activities at this phase. The first activity is, what are the stories we need to detail for a given iteration? So you're not looking at all the stories at once, and at the same time, you're not ignoring the details. You are spending time during an iteration detailing as much stories as you think will be implemented in another iteration. The second activity is this vertical bar where you are taking input from the current iteration and you're giving feedback as to what's being implemented currently. And the third thing is, you look back on a previous iteration, exercise those, and make sure that all loose ends have been tied and everything looks good, or you have other feedbacks to go forward. Now, it's possible that the stories you think of for a future iteration may not be in the iteration based on what's going on in the current iteration. So you can see that the details you provide to iteration 2 is influenced by iteration 1 certainly. But the beauty of this approach I've seen at work is that the teams are not sitting there wondering what the requirements are. There is enough detail available to them because the customers and the team leaders have spent time with the planning of the iteration. More important, detailing the user stories with enough details for the team to have when they start the iteration. And they're providing an active continuous feedback cycle. This also clearly indicates to the management that if they want to be running an Agile project, they need to have a certain amount of time and discipline and resources available with various experiences to be able to support this project. You cannot just have customers walk in sometimes and give feedback. They need to actively be doing three activities: detailing user stories, providing continuous feedback to the team, and evaluating the progress made from the previous iteration. And this two-pronged approach of managing a project is something I've found to be thoroughly effective in companies that have done really good agile projects. And when I show this to companies that are struggling through agile development, they seem to catch on to this fairly well and say, that's the part we are missing, the top part seems to be missing, that seems to help us in getting our job done.
Venkat,
so
one question in the previous page itself. So do you have any guidance of how much detail on the requirements is adequate or appropriate? Because if you don't give enough detail, if your top row doesn't provide enough detail, then the developers in the bottom spur have to figure stuff out and go back for clarification. On the other hand, if on the top one, if they overdo the detail, then that they can get bogged down at that level itself. So how detailed is detail enough when you talk about stories or requirements?
So there are two things to think about. One is that is something you also evolve based on retrospection. Bring the team together and say, is there enough detail? Do we need to do more? Are we doing too much? Certainly, we can learn from the fact that we have this phase. We can start learning that. What I've noticed to be fairly good detail is we got a description of the user story where we give a certain detail to begin with, and then we have a few test cases that highlight the type of test we're going to have on that particular user story. And if it's a little bit of a more detail about the domain, we could even have some equations and formula that they have experimented and built in. Those get included as well. What I've noticed to be pretty interesting in this approach is once the team starts putting these details together, in the beginning of a project, they often tend to put a little bit more detail. But once the team gets comfortable with the application, the product, and the domain itself, they tend to go a little lesser on the details because the team is able to pick up the details than they had to have in the beginning. So this is something that you can start off, and again, this is where I think having the team leader and the tester in the meeting helps to know, hey, are we giving enough detail for you? Are we giving too much detail? If you want to have these customers in isolation doing this, it certainly becomes a concern. But because the lead programmer and the tester are part of this activity, there is a good balance for them to guide along and say, that's adequate detail. No, that's way too much. You are trying to do more than we really need to. And then we start learning along the way and working towards it. So it's important to strike a rhythm as we develop the product there are certain activities that happen every few minutes. There are certain activities that happen every couple of hours to days to weeks. And certainly at the end of the iteration, you want to demo the product. But the problem is, I really don't like demos because people do demos and that becomes a ceremony. One of the things I value the most is where the customers can exercise the product and not just look at a demo. The type of feedback you get when customers exercise your product and then how you respond to it is much more valuable. So I don't want to work on projects where we simply do a demo at the end of iteration. We want customers to exercise the product. That's been very valuable to us. And then of course releases short increments. I would say 1 to 6 months, maybe on some projects, maybe 6 to 12 months. You be the judge how much time that is. But certainly as soon as possible, realistically, within a year, you want to have at least one release or more. And that is very critical because one of the benefits of Agile development itself is to start getting revenue and ease the burden on the project. A project that is receiving revenue is the one that's the easiest to fund as well. So it has a lot of impact on the economy at large also in terms of the economic scale of projects and companies. So I think finding this rhythm is extremely important. To summarize, about the pragmatics, it's important for us to always ask the question why and understand why we are doing certain things. And when we ask why, it's not with an intent to insult somebody, but to just get a better understanding of it. So don't hesitate to ask why. Be very adaptive in your approach. and actively seek the feedback. I think feedback cycle is extremely important. Make change affordable and predictable. This is a programmer activity certainly, but we need to think about reversibility and how can we really make it affordable. And then release frequently and start your test very early on and automate your test cases. Create lean and useful documentation. It's not to avoid documentation, but to create a lean and useful documentation. I favor executable documentation more than Word documents, certainly. And then practice evolutionary design and architecture. And then, of course, use your automated tests and unit tests as a safety net to evolve your design and make sure your evolutionary design actually works as well. So those are some of the thoughts about, thinking about being pragmatic about agile development, and starting with the first question, why, and then going down to the implements and be willing to change along the way.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Venkat.
Thank you.
So there are a few questions here that we didn't get along the way. So in the spirit of Agile, since we have 5 minutes remaining, what we'll do is we'll skip the synods of introduction, but I'll bring up a page here just to tee up the questions, and then we'll take a couple more questions that have come up, which might be better use of time for the audience. So one of the questions is in your two-tier page that you talked about, where there's a planning iteration activity on the top and then execution going on in the bottom. There were a couple of people who were common on the both top and the bottom level. So one of them, a couple of people, or one was dev lead or team lead that you called for your development side, and that lead tester. So how do you, what guidance do you have on the time allocation that these two key people have to have on planning the next iteration versus doing what they need to do in the current iteration?
It varies as the timeline goes. In the beginning, I would say probably they would be split about 50-50. And then as the project progresses further, they may decide to spend a little bit more time on development activities where needed. So it's more of a floating. One of the things we also do, quite a few things we didn't touch on here, is in projects where we have practiced this, we do not only pair programming, but we also do pair rotations. So just because the team leader is in the top level activity, it doesn't bring anything to a grinding halt. There are other people who can pick up and keep running along the way. So the fact that they have to spend time, so I would say start with about a 50-50 time allocation and then vary it based on what you see on your particular project. Be flexible about it. The team leader, certainly, again, I'm saying leader here. It's more of a programmer, a mature programmer, if you want to call it that way, and somebody who can easily come in, pick up things, and get it moving on both sides. That's the most important thing. But start with the 50-50 and vary it based on what you find.
Okay, all right, great, thanks. Let's take another question, going back to the feedback that you talked about in the beginning, which is the core essence of Agile development, to seek customer feedback. So in your experience, is there a notion of appropriate level of feedback? Is there such thing as too much feedback, which may result in whiplash in software development, which is you go back and forth, and every time you go back, you get a new input. So is there a happy medium of how much feedback is appropriate not to create a whiplash for the software team?
I think that's a very good question. And the answer to it is, it's not about having too much feedback, but I would say that means the feedback you really want to have. And if you find that they're not converging towards a set of features, and if they keep changing their requirements on you quite a bit, if you get to know that fairly early in the development cycle, we have unearthed a problem that's going to turn into a potential nightmare. So it's not about turning them off from the feedback, but to go back and say, I'm glad you guys are coming back with all these requirements and changes, but let's also realize that this is changing what we did in the previous iteration, which already changed based on what we did before. So it's important. There's something that's missing here. Maybe there's somebody else that needs to be involved who need to bring in a certain amount of understanding. It's also possible that they're changing things so rapidly because they haven't spent the time in the top cycle we talked about. So use those feedback not to say, oh my God, you're giving me feedback, I don't want it, but to say, hey, I'm glad you guys are coming out with this feedback, but this also indicates that we are not really converging towards what this product is supposed to be. And that's a problem we need to address. So use that to your advantage to bring that out. I think the goal is not to say and point fingers and say, you customers don't have a clue. That's really not the intent, but to really say, maybe this is complex and we need to really have, other people involved, or maybe we're not spending as much time. Use that as an opportunity to ask, why are we changing this so much? What's missing here? And how could we improve on this? I think it's an opportunity for us to get things better. So I don't think it's a bad thing to get that feedback. It's important, more important, what we do about that feedback.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Venkat, for the webinar and the questions that you've taken. We have come to the end of the time we allocated for it, so we'll wrap up here and hopefully pick up the rest of the questions offline if we need to. And thank you all of the participants for coming to this webinar. We'll have another one next month as usual. And one more time, thank you, Venkat, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Hemant, and thanks for everyone for